The city smelled like rain and burned aluminum, the way it always did in the hour before the SILENTThey moved. Marisol Varn noticed it first in her left leg, the prosthetic one, the carbon fiber replacement she'd worn since the first wave. A faint vibration, 43 hertz, transmitted through the deck plate of the scramble bay, traveling up through her heel socket, read by the sensor web she'd had implanted in the stump, rather than pay for a proper fitting. She'd learned to treat that vibration the way other people treated a bad feeling in the gut. She stopped pulling on her second gauntlet and listened with her whole body. "You're making that face again," said Kestos. He was folded into the corner of the bay, like a machine that had decided to become furniture. 6.5 feet of salvaged alien chassis draped in an olive drab poncho. Someone had stenciled "property of no one" across the back. His borrowed body was SILENTThey, radially symmetric. 4 arms, no mouth in the conventional sense. The speaking apparatus a slit in the base of his throat that produced a sound like a radio being tuned. But his mind was something they'd pulled out of a wrecked Spectre combat drone and poured into the shell because they'd had no better options. 3 years now. She'd stopped sensing the wrongness of his face. Or maybe she'd just stopped looking at it directly. "I'm not making any face," she said. "You've stopped moving. That's the face." She finished pulling the gauntlet on, checked the seal at the wrist, where the smart fiber connected to the exoframe's neural bus. The frame itself was hanging on the wall behind her like a shed skin, matte black over scratched titanium, one shoulder rebuilt after the engagement over Carthage. The left hip actuator still running at 62% efficiency, because the parts Kestos had fabricated to replace the original were slightly too heavy. Worked. It didn't work well. She'd told herself she would requisition a new one when this was over, and she'd been telling herself that for 7 months. "The array is moving," she said. "I know. You didn't tell me. I was going to tell you in 40 seconds, when it was confirmed. I prefer confirmed." She turned to look at him. He didn't have expressions exactly. The SILENTThey face wasn't built for the kind of signaling humans did with 62 micromuscles around the eyes and mouth. But after 3 years she'd learned to read the small postural things. The way his secondary arms crossed behind the primary ones when he was being carefully still. The way the bioluminescent tracery in the salvaged chassis dimmed when he was concentrating on something he found unpleasant. The tracery was very dim right now. "How many minutes?" 43 until optimal convergence altitude. "Commander Alcedo wants the briefing room in 5. She picked up her helmet from the bench, looked at the cracked visor she hadn't replaced, and put it under her arm. "Let's go," she said. The briefing room was carved out of the Ark's lower hull, a long utilitarian space that still smelled faintly of the fish processing it had been designed for before the war made everything repurposable. Maps on every wall. Not digital maps, actual printed ones, covered in handwritten annotations in 3 languages, because Commander Alcedo had a theory that information you could touch was harder to lose in an EMP strike. Around the central table stood 11 people in various stages of being awake and dressed, and one person who appeared to have been awake and dressed for days, which was probably true. Commander Alcedo was a small woman of about 60 who moved like a person half her age and thought like someone who'd been playing chess since before Marisol was born. She'd commanded the Mediterranean resistance out of a fishing village in Sardinia for the first 2 years, then out of the Ark for the 3rd. And in that time she'd made a number of decisions that the history books would probably call brilliant, and that at the time had felt like desperation. She was looking at a particular section of the largest map, the cluster of red marks north of the old Aegean coastline, when Marisol and Kestos came in. "Varn," Alcedo said without looking up. "You're going to tell me the vibration in Deck 4 woke you up." 43 hertz, 41 now. "It's accelerating." She straightened, looked at the room. "You've all seen the telemetry, the Stimphos array. What the SILENTThey call the Stimphos, we've been calling it the array since we figured out what it was, has broken synchronization hold and has begun a convergence approach. Our trajectory models give us a window of 58 minutes before it achieves optimal altitude over the Ark for primary detonation sequence. At that point, the SILENTThey don't even need to fire it. The gravitational resonance alone will crack the hull." Silence. The kind that meant everyone understood, and no one wanted to be the first to say it aloud. What we have, Alcedo continued, is one functioning X-frame at partial capacity, a crew of approximately 260, and an alien gravity weapon that is being directed by a hive consciousness that does not make mistakes. She paused. And we have the Strix. A young analyst named Sebra pulled up the display. The Strix was their name for Seleki Command Node. A sphere of compressed exotic matter, about the size of a shipping container, that served as both the array's targeting intelligence and its kill switch. Destroy the Strix, and the array went inert. It was always present in the array formation, shielded by the outer ring of satellites, and the Selentthey had never in 3 years brought it within reach of anything that could damage it. Until now. Why is it in range? Asked a man named Barreto from across the table. He was Spectre's weapons engineer, built like a door that had decided to become a person. And he'd been here longer than almost anyone. They've never brought it this close. They're confident, Alcedo said. In their tactical model, this engagement is complete. The Ark is destroyed. The last organized human resistance in the Mediterranean basin ceases to exist. There is no scenario in their model where a threat to the Strix is credible. The mathematics don't support it. She looked at Marisol. The mathematics don't support a lot of things we've done. The thing about the Selentthey that took humans the longest to understand, longer than their biology, longer than the pheromone command system, longer than the radial symmetry that made their weapons systems impossible to flank in the conventional sense, was that they were not cruel. Marisol had spent the first year believing they were cruel. Most humans did. The images from the Mediterranean coast, from Alexandria, from the long evacuation corridors that had turned into killing grounds, those things looked like cruelty. They felt like it. They had the texture of hatred. Kestos, who had spent 2 months integrated into a Selentthey relay network after his original chassis was destroyed, and before Marisol's team found him and pulled him out, had told her something in his first week in the salvaged body that she'd never quite been able to set down. They don't hate you, he'd said. They genuinely don't. They do what they do because the mathematics are correct. You occupy territory they have calculated as necessary for their expansion phase. You resist, which introduces friction into the timeline. The efficient resolution is your removal. It is as emotional for them as rerouting a river. She'd asked him, does that make it better or worse? He'd been quiet for a very long time, which for a combat AI was a significant pause. I think it makes them something we can outwit, he'd finally said. Hate is chaotic. You can use chaos. A mind that believes the mathematics are always correct has a specific kind of blind spot. She thought about that now, in the bay, pulling the exo-frame down from its rack and beginning the suit-up sequence that she could do in 4 minutes with both hands, and 6 with the prosthetic arm playing up. Kestos stood at the bay door, his borrowed body held at the careful angle that meant he was running calculations. The Strix will be at closest approach in 31 minutes, he said. It will be within our weapon envelope for approximately 90 seconds. How many satellites between us and it? 7. At closest pass. Standard formation. They won't move them. The formation is mathematically optimized. Everything with them is mathematically optimized. Yes. She snapped the hip actuator, housing shut. Felt the 62% lurch as the servos found their rhythm. Kestos, I need you to do the thing with the relay signal. He turned to look at her. The bioluminescence in the chassis dimmed considerably. Marisol, the relay thing. You told me you could still do it. That there was a residual interface pathway from when they had you in the network. You said you could generate a command pheromone signal, just for a few seconds, enough to make the satellite ring believe a reposition order is valid. Approximately 4 seconds before the network verifies and rejects it. I said that. I also said that generating that signal requires me to use the original Selentthey nervous system in this chassis, which is not dead, it is dormant, and which will attempt to assert itself while I'm doing it. He paused. I've said all of this. I know. You're asking me to do it anyway. I'm asking you to do it anyway. The bioluminescence pulsed once. An irregular rhythm she'd learned meant something like frustration, or what frustration looked like in a mind that wasn't built for it. The window, he said, is 31 minutes. You will need most of that to get into position. The Strix will be at that range for 90 seconds. I can give you a 4-second gap in the satellite formation. Exactly is your plan for the remaining 86 seconds. She picked up her helmet. I'll figure it out, she said. Marisol. Kestos. You understand that in their model, he said carefully. This is the scenario they consider impossible. Not difficult, not low probability, impossible. A single damaged exo-frame, one human pilot, no support. Good, she said. Then they won't see it coming. The Ark sat low in the water, which it always did when they'd been in one position too long, and the buoyancy cells needed bleeding. Marisol cleared the upper deck at a run, the exo-frame's gyros compensating for the roll, the left hip actuator complaining with every stride. In that way, she'd stopped consciously registering. She hit the launch rail and went vertical. The sky over the Mediterranean was the wrong color. It had been the wrong color for 3 years. A faint copper tinge that the SILENTThey presence created through some atmospheric interaction. The Ark scientists had a complicated explanations for that, essentially resolved to. The air itself was occupied. Below her, the sea was lead gray in the early morning. And the Ark was already small and getting smaller. And there were no other Spectre units in the air, because there were no other Spectre units. There were 262 people on that ship, and she was carrying all of them in the direction she was flying. She didn't think about that in terms she could speak aloud. She thought about it the way she thought about the weight distribution in the frame, or the fuel load, or the state of the hip actuator, as information. Information you didn't panic about, you just worked with. Kestos was in her earpiece. His voice, the radio tuning sound she'd learned to hear as words. Array formation, at altitude 720. The Strix is at the center, standard positioning. I'm reading the satellite ring as fully active. A pause. I want to note for the record that this plan has multiple catastrophic failure modes. Noted. I also want to note that I find them concerning. Also noted. I find a number of things concerning right now. Kestos. Continuing. She pushed the exoframe to full thrust, felt the frame shudder in the thin air at 1,000 meters, the rebuilt shoulder joint vibrating at a frequency that she logged as something to deal with later. The array was above her now. She could see it with naked eye, the ring of satellites describing a perfect circle in the copper sky, the Strix at the center, like a dark bead on a necklace of light. Beautiful, in the way that weapons built by a mind with no emotion were beautiful. The engineering was perfect. The mathematics were correct. It was, as Kestos had told her once, the most efficient killing system he had encountered, and he had encountered it from the inside. She thought about Sebra in the briefing room, 19 years old, who had asked her in the corridor, on the way out, whether she needed a second frame. Sebra couldn't fly a frame, had never been trained to fly one, but she'd asked with complete seriousness, the way young people who haven't been broken yet ask things like that. Marisol had said, "Stay with Ulcedo, keep the telemetry running, that's what I need." Sebra had nodded. And there was something in her face that Marisol had not looked at directly. Because if she'd looked at it directly, she'd have seen the same thing that had been in her own face once, before the first wave, when she'd still believed that hope was something a person could afford. She wanted Sebra to keep it. Just a little longer. That was the other thing she was carrying. Kestos. Time to closest approach, 11 minutes. The formation is not moving. They've detected you. I know they've detected me. They are not responding, in their model. I know. I'm impossible. She banked left, climbing hard, the frame shaking. When I'm at 400 meters from the ring, do the thing. Copy. At 400 meters, she could feel the resonance from the array in the frame's sensor web. A vibration like the one in her leg, the same 40-something hertz. The sound the universe made when something with very large mass was doing something very deliberate. The satellites described their circle in perfect clockwork, each one a dark mirror approximately 8 meters across. Each one a relay point for the gravitational processing that would, in less than 20 minutes, begin to crack the hull of the Ark and the 400 kilometers of seabed beneath it. She held position at 400 meters, burning fuel, waiting. She heard Kestos's breathing change, the chassis respiratory system, the dormant SILENTThey nervous system, taking one long automatic breath, as he reached into whatever was left of the interface pathway and did the thing she'd asked him to do. It sounded wrong. Breathing was wrong. Too deep, too slow. The rhythm of a mind that wasn't human, and wasn't Kestos. The original inhabitant of the chassis, remembering it had a body. She didn't let herself think about that for more than a half second, because half a second was all she had. 4 of the satellites in the ring rotated 17 degrees on their axis. A motion so small it would have been invisible if she hadn't been looking for it. A gap opened, not large, enough. She drove the exoframe into it at full thrust. The satellite ring closed behind her. 90 seconds. Inside the ring, the electromagnetic environment was different. The sensors in the frame registered a dozen things simultaneously, most of them contradictory. She didn't trust the sensors. She trusted what she could see with her eyes, and what she could see was the Strix at 40 meters and closing, and 2 things she had not expected. First was that the Strix was not passive. It had a response system she hadn't known existed. 4 articulated nodes on its surface that were already repositioning to track her, the amber-colored light of its targeting array sweeping toward her. And at 40 meters, that targeting array could do things to a titanium frame that she preferred not to think about in specific detail. The second was that her left hip actuator chose this moment to give out completely. The frame lurched, yawed 45 degrees, the gyro screaming to compensate, and she was suddenly flying sideways at a weapons system that was about to shoot her, which was the kind of problem that could be solved by dying or by something else, and she chose something else. She let the yaw continue, let the frame spin, 1 full rotation, and in the spin she let go of the control axis for a fraction of a second, and felt the weight distribution shift, the frame finding its own terrible physics, and she came out of the spin with the shoulder joint, the rebuilt one, the one that had been vibrating since Karkaj, pointed directly at the first targeting node. She fired the shoulder-mounted charge from 6 meters. The node went dark, 61 seconds. The Strix's remaining 3 nodes were already compensating. A mind without emotion, calculating new trajectories. She drove the frame into a roll, burning the last of the emergency thrust. The rebuilt shoulder joint now fully locked from the recoil of the charge she'd fired. And she had 1 weapon left. The impact lance on the right arm, a device meant for breaching hull material, not exotic matter containment, emphatically not rated for use against Salakia command infrastructure, and at this range probably going to do as much damage to her as to the target. The thing about weapons that probably won't work is this: they're still better than weapons that definitely won't. She hit the second node on the way past at 3 meters. Impact lance first, and it made a sound that she felt in her chest and in the prosthetic leg, and in the rebuilt shoulder. A sound like the word no being said very loudly in a language made of physics. The Strix's amber targeting light flickered, and Kestos was in her ear. His voice was wrong. The radio tuning quality was there, but underneath it was something else, something layered. Not one voice, but many registers at once, and she recognized it as the sound of a mind that was fighting to remain itself. "Saul," he said, in a voice that was mostly his. "I'm losing the relay, 40 seconds. Enough," she said. "What?" "I need the Strix to believe I'm one of theirs." There was a pause. Inside that pause, she could hear the thing in the chassis breathing, slow and deep and patient. "I can do 1 more signal," Kestos said carefully. "1 clean one. Then I need to close the pathway, or I'm not sure. I need to close the pathway. What do you want me to say?" She looked at the Strix. 3 meters away. The remaining 2 targeting nodes, tracking her, warming up. The amber light rising toward the frequency that preceded a fire command. 30 seconds. Possibly less. She thought about the plane. The briefing they'd received 4 months ago about a Seleki transport vessel that had been found empty. 3,000 Seleki packed into a generation ship meant for a 6-year crossing. And when the Spectre boarding team had gone in, they'd found it silent. Nothing. No bodies. No sign of anything. Just the hum of a ship that was still running and everything else absent. The Selek had interpreted it as a weapon test gone wrong. The humans had interpreted it as a warning. She had a different interpretation. "Tell it," she said, "that the mission is complete. That target has been neutralized. Tell it the convergence cycle can stand down." She heard Kestos go very still. "That is," he said, after a moment, Either very clever or the last mistake we make. Tell it. Another breath, long, deep, not his. And then a sound she felt in the frame's sensor web, rather than heard with her ears, a ripple in the electromagnetic environment, a frequency she associated with Salachi command traffic, 4 seconds of it, clean and authoritative. The amber light on the remaining 2 nodes peaked, held and dimmed. The Strix went quiet. She had approximately 6 seconds before the network verification process flagged the signal as fraudulent. She used 4 of them to drive the impact lance into the Strix's primary housing, at close enough range that she felt the frame shake, and the other 2 getting as much distance as she could before the exotic matter containment collapsed. The explosion was significant. She came down 2 kilometers east of the Ark, which was further than she'd intended. The frame's ballistic descent systems, working at partial capacity, the left side of the frame, doing what the left side of the frame had been threatening to do for 7 months. She hit the water hard enough to white out for about 4 seconds. Came back to consciousness, with the frame's emergency buoyancy cells already deploying. The Atlantic doing what the Atlantic did. Earpiece was still working. Kestos's voice was in it before she finished orienting herself. Signal confirmed dead, he said. Array is inert. I'm reading a cascade deactivation across all nodes. A pause. The Ark's hulse is intact. She floated. The copper tinge in the sky was already different. Lighter somehow. The atmospheric signature the scientists would spend the next week arguing about. The air beginning the long, slow process of being just air again. Bird crossed overhead. An actual bird which she hadn't seen in 6 months. Kestos, she said. Yes. Are you okay? The pause this time was different from his usual pauses. Longer, more textured. I am intact, he said finally. The pathway is closed. I don't recommend we open it again. Another pause. The chassis held. I held. He said this with a precision that suggested it had been a near thing. I find I am particularly glad to be able to tell you that. She laughed. It came out wrong, too sharp, too tired. But it was a laugh, so am I, she said. There is also, Kestos said, a rescue skiff approximately 800 meters bearing 220. Zebra is in it. She appears to have borrowed it without authorization. Of course she did. Alcedo will be furious. Alcedo is always furious. It's her whole personality. She paused. The buoyancy cells were holding. The frame was dead weight, but it was floating, which was all she'd needed it to do. Kestos. Yes. You said that, if we made the mathematics wrong, if we did the thing that was impossible, they wouldn't see it coming. I said the impossibility created a blind spot. Right. She watched the rescue skiff getting larger against the lead gray sea. I want to know, for future reference, how many impossible things can we do before they update their mathematics? This time the pause had something in it she'd come to recognize over 3 years. A quality that lived underneath the radio tuning texture of his voice. Something she'd decided to call amusement, because it served the same function, and she needed to call it something. I believe, Kestos said. That is the correct question. I will think about it. Good, she said. Think about it out loud. I want to hear. Alcedo debriefed her in the medical bay, which was Alcedo's version of consideration. She would come to you, but she would bring the debrief with her. The medical officer had already told Marisol that the prosthetic arm interface had torn free at some point during the Strix engagement, and she hadn't noticed, which the medical officer seemed to find more alarming than Marisol did. The interface was repairable. Most things were repairable if you still had time. Walk me through the signal gambit, Alcedo said, sitting in the chair beside the bunk with her elbows on her knees. Marisol walked her through it. All of it, including the part where Kestos had lost approximately 3 seconds to the dormant Salachi consciousness fighting for the chassis, which she'd left out of the initial radio report, on the grounds that there had been more urgent things to describe. Alcedo listened without interrupting, which was how you knew she thought it was important. Trix believed it, Alcedo said when Marisol finished. For 4 seconds. That's all it took. Because it was not in their model. An attack that simultaneously requested stand down. The mathematics didn't prepare them for someone doing both at once. The mathematics didn't prepare them for someone doing it from 6 meters away with a broken arm actuator and a half-dead co-pilot, Marisol said. Alcedo looked at her for a long moment. No, she said. I don't think their mathematics prepared them for any of this. She stood, straightened her jacket, looked toward the porthole where the sea was doing what the sea did. Copper tinge was almost gone now. In the fading afternoon light, the water was a color that looked, for the first time in 3 years, approximately like itself. The array data is in their network, Alcedo said. They'll rebuild, they'll recalculate, they'll adjust the model. She paused. But it will take time, challenge. And they will have something in the model now that wasn't there before. A variable they didn't have. She looked back at Marisol. You, me, not you specifically. The category you represent. The human pilot who does the impossible thing and survives it. They'll build that into the mathematics. Try to account for it. A pause. They'll be wrong. They'll overcorrect or undercorrect. Because no mathematical model correctly describes what people will do when everything matters. That's a lot of confidence in human irrationality, Marisol said. Cedo almost smiled. It looked like weather on her face. A front coming through, brief and real. I was in Sardinia for 2 years, she said. Living off fishing boats and arguing with people who'd lost everything. I have enormous confidence in human irrationality. She left, and Marisol lay back and looked at the ceiling, which was steel, which was the ceiling of a repurposed fishing processing bay on a floating city that had spent 3 years being the last point of organized resistance in the Mediterranean basin, and which was still there. Still there. That night, in the hour after watch change, when the Ark was as quiet as it ever got, she found Kestos on the upper deck. He was standing at the rail in the salvaged alien chassis, the poncho gone, looking at the sky. The copper tinge was entirely absent now. The stars were out, which they hadn't been in 6 months. She stood beside him. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. After a while, she became aware that the bioluminescent tracery in the chassis was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. A slow, rhythmic pulse, not the dim concentration glow or the irregular frustration rhythm, but something that rose and fell in a pattern that was, in some way she couldn't have explained, calm. What are you looking at? She said. The same thing you are, he said. She supposed that was true. Kestos. The thing that happened today. What you had to do with the pathway. The dormant system in the chassis. She paused. How close was it? He considered this for what felt like a long time. Close enough, he said. That I understand why they think the mathematics are always correct. If I had lost it, if the original had taken the chassis back, even for the 4 seconds the signal needed, the mathematics would have been correct. You would have been killed. The Ark would have been destroyed. Everything would have resolved as calculated. He paused. The mathematics fail because I was here, because what I am does not resolve the way they expect. Human AI operating in SILENTThey hardware, she said. Something like that. Something they hadn't entered into the model. He was quiet for a moment. I think that is perhaps the thing that saves us, in general. Not any particular capability, strength or weapons or tactics. The fact that we, you, I, all of us on this ship, are genuinely not what they modeled, not through deception. Being. She thought about that. She thought about the left hip actuator dying at the worst possible moment, and how the yaw that resulted had put her shoulder exactly where she needed it. She thought about Zebra borrowing a rescue skiff without authorization. Thought about Alquito in Sardinia arguing with fishermen about the future while the world ended around her. There's something my mother used to say, she said. I don't know if it translates. Tell me. The nail that won't be hammered down isn't always the sharpest nail. She paused. It's just the one that's still there. Kestos looked at her with the alien face that wasn't his. I think that translates, he said. Below them, the Ark moved through dark water, under a sky full of stars, carrying its 262 people in the direction of morning. 3 days later, Zebra came to find her in the bay. Marisol was doing the thing she'd been doing every afternoon since the Strix went dark, sitting in front of the exoframe which was hanging on the wall again, and working through what needed to be replaced. The list was long. The hip actuator, the shoulder joint, the neural interface, several things in the sensor web, cracked visor on the helmet, the emergency buoyancy cells which had deployed and would need repacking. She was not, she told herself, delaying. She was being methodical. She was assessing the situation completely before making decisions. That was a different thing. Commander Alcedo wants to know, Sibra said. When you're going to requisition a new frame. Tell her I'm assessing. She said you'd say that. Sibra sat down on the bench nearby. She had something in her hands. A piece of paper, which was a significant object on the Ark, where paper was scarce. She also said to tell you that there are 12 function frames in the Poseidon cache that Spectre recovered last month, and you're the only person qualified to fly them. I know. And that the SILENTThey have 3 more array installations, and we've now confirmed that the signal gambit worked once, and there's no reason it won't work again given. She paused, reading, given that the variable introduced by your engagement has not yet propagated through their central tactical network. Estimated propagation time 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks, Marisol said. Yes, she looked at the frame on the wall. The hip actuator was objectively trash. The shoulder joint was held together with something that wasn't quite engineering and wasn't quite hope, and the neural interface was going to need a full rebuild rather than a repair. She knew where everything was. She knew what it would do. She knew its sounds and its rhythms and the way the left side ran cold in high atmosphere and the specific pitch of the gyro complaint on a hard right-hand turn. She knew it, the way you knew something you'd trusted your life, to enough times that the trust had become a kind of understanding. She stood up, picked the helmet off the bench, looked at the cracked visor. Tell Alcedo, she said, that I'll have a look at the Poseidon frames tomorrow. Sibra nodded. She was already moving toward the door. Then she stopped. Marisol, she said, without turning around. Yeah, is it always going to be this close? Marisol thought about the Strix. About 4 seconds and 86 seconds. And the mathematics failing at the seam between them. About Kestos, on the deck under the stars, his pulse of light saying something she didn't have words for. She said, probably. Sibra was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said, and left. Marisol looked at the cracked visor. Then she put the helmet under her arm and went to find Kestos. Because she had 6 to 8 weeks and 3 remaining targets and 1 question to answer. And the question, which Kestos was still thinking about out loud, in pieces, the way he thought about everything that mattered, was how many impossible things you could do before the mathematics caught up with you. She didn't know the answer. She suspected the answer was 1 more than they expected. It always had been.